Recently, a feminist woman published an article in the Atlantic magazine about how angry she got at her husband because he didn't vote for Elizabeth Warren in the Democratic presidential race. Read in the context of centuries-old arguments about women and politics, this particular woman's very public meltdown shows us once again the destructive power of an ideology that encourages women to be their worst selves. The decision by Elizabeth Warren to withdraw from the presidential race led to a chorus of lamentation across the land as feminists made clear their belief that the time for a female president was long past due. It was rehashed on many talk shows that women make better leaders because they are supposedly more compassionate and more collaborative than men, as in the following clip from The View.
It's like there's this quote that, like, where's my jetpack? Where's my woman president? Like, why are we still here as Americans? And I think it's frustrating. And for me, I'd love it to be a conservative woman, like, happy if it's Nikki Haley or someone like else. But I do think women traditionally are better leaders in a lot of situations because we're more compassionate and we don't have to deal.
There's more collaboration.
Yes.
In every country.
And I think for me, I'm 35. I'm going to be 36 by the next election, or almost, 36 the next election. Where's my woman president? I would like a woman to be president.
Maybe you should run.
The idea that one should cast one's ballot at least partially, if not entirely, according to the sex of the candidate would of course be outrageous if it were said about a man, and feminists do often allege without evidence that men won't vote for female candidates because of sexism. But somehow it's not considered sexist to advocate voting for a female candidate because she's a woman, or even, as we'll see, to suggest that men owe it to women to vote for a female president. Over 100 years ago, when voting rights for women were being debated across the English-speaking world, what are now sometimes considered female advantages in politics, such as women's touted compassion and people skills, were generally held to be disadvantages. Opponents of extending the franchise to women argued that the female temperament, while well suited for family life and the helping professions, didn't equip women to be responsible voters or political leaders. Women possessed many admirable qualities, the anti-suffragists declared, but in the main they didn't possess the crucial ability to put rational principle above passion, or to separate self-interest from the common good. It was also alleged that women tended to lack knowledge and interest in political matters such as economics and international relations. Writing in the Globe newspaper in 1885, Canadian journalist Sara Jeannette Duncan, though she was cautiously in favor of women's suffrage, still warned that many women would need to acquire a far deeper understanding of public affairs than they possessed at present if they were ever to vote intelligently. Like some of those who opposed the vote for women, Duncan believed women were too easily influenced by personality and feeling rather than rational argument, and would be more likely than men to make political decisions based on the candidate they liked best rather than on the candidate's political platform. British anti-suffragist and essayist Ethel Harrison put it more harshly in 1909 when she asserted that, quote, "the point of hysterical emotion and unreason is always nearer with women. Women's nerve force is slighter," she said, "and their self-restraint less," end quote. Anti-suffragists admitted that, of course, not all women had these disabilities, just as not all men were paragons of reason, but in general, they insisted on the reality of intellectual and emotional sex differences. Lord Cromer, a British opponent of women's suffrage, feared that women's much-discussed compassion would lead in the direction of socialism, unsustainable government debt, and ever greater expansion of the state. Perhaps it is too soon to say whether those who opposed the vote for women were right or not. The century that followed the granting of the women's vote saw neither the dramatic change for the worse feared by the anti-suffragists nor the dramatic change for the better forecast by the pro-woman suffragists. But one thing is inarguable. The woman question, as it was then called, basically the discussion of the role that women should play in public life, including women's complaints and demands, that remained at the forefront of public debate. So let's look at the aforementioned article by a fervent female supporter of Elizabeth Warren in order to consider the habits of mind of a feminist voter extolling the virtues of a woman president. The article is by Ellen O'Connell Whittet, an essayist and lecturer in the writing program at the University of California at Santa Barbara. It is titled, "I voted for Warren, my husband voted for Sanders, and I feel betrayed." In the subtitle, the aggrieved wife tells us that, quote, "voting for a progressive woman felt like a chance so rare that it caused me to fume at my own husband for making a different decision," end quote. Notice how forms of the verb to feel appear in both the main heading and the explanatory subheading, and the emphasis on feeling is sustained throughout this rather melodramatic and, dare I say, hysterical piece of writing. The husband, it seems, isn't allowed to feel anything except appropriate male contrition and deference to his angry wife. In a saner time, one might have expected an article with that kind of title and subtitle to move in a certain predictable narrative direction, from anger and self-righteousness to self-awareness, as the woman writer comes to recognize that it is irrational, even perhaps a sign of megalomania, to be mad at her husband over his vote. But that's not the direction of this essay. In fact, it ends pretty well right where it began, with the woman in question still licking her wounds and seemingly unable or unwilling to accept that her husband doesn't exist solely to gratify her imagined needs. She comes to no epiphany, remaining totally blind to the enormity of her own behavior. And it's worth noting that the context for her anger is entirely trivial. It's not like the husband was opposed to the idea of a female president or came to bed wearing a MAGA hat. On the contrary, Whittet's hubby is a committed progressive and a pro-Warren feminist. He merely made a strategic choice to vote for Bernie. But even this minor difference of opinion in philosophy and strategy could not be borne by Whittet, who tells the reader in more detail than we need to know about, quote, tearful conversations and failed attempts to make her husband understand the necessity of Warren. After they voted, she berated him for refusing to support a woman when it mattered. She even pressed him to say he regretted his vote and was disappointed he couldn't even offer her that. It is simply impossible to imagine a man writing about his uncontrollable anger over his wife's voting choice and getting that published in a highbrow magazine. Whittet concludes the article, nursing what she calls her grief, bonding with her equally aggrieved woman friends, and making it clear to her husband in a subtle threat that he had better think differently next time so that, quote, whoever the first progressive woman president is, my husband and I can vote for her together, end quote. Such stubborn, pointless anger is a clear realization of the fears of the anti-suffrage campaigners back in the 19th century who worried that women were far better at being unhappy about things than at understanding the causes of problems or knowing how to solve them. Sara Jeannette Duncan made the point in 1885 that it was all very well for women to complain passionately about the wrongs of their society, but in order for women to participate usefully in public life, as she said, quote, to ardor they must add acumen, and to sincerity, sagacity, and to disgust with present conditions, the ability to improve them, end quote. She feared that very few women had or even cared to acquire the necessary acumen, sagacity, or ability to understand politics. Even a century before the suffrage movement, commentators on women's position in society recognized the problem of women's greater susceptibility to emotion. In 1792, British writer Mary Wollstonecraft, future wife of political radical William Godwin and future mother of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, published her A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Here she proposed that female emotionalism should and would diminish when women were properly educated to the same degree as men. She argued that men and women were equally capable of rational judgment and self-control, and she blamed men for encouraging women's sentimental excesses. In the decades that followed, women's educational opportunities expanded significantly as universities and the professions were open to them. But the revolution in female psychology that Wollstonecraft had spoken about failed to materialize. Why was that? Put simply, at the same time that women became more active outside the home than ever before in the West, freed by male-invented technology to enter public life to a degree formerly impossible, rather than embracing Wollstonecraft's prescription, many feminist leaders promoted the idea that women were more emotional than men, and that this was a good thing, something to be defended and promoted in all areas of life, including the political, as we saw in the clip from The View, where media personality Meghan McCain was applauded for asserting that women are more compassionate than men and that being compassionate is a key quality for a U.S. president. 100 years earlier, Canadian feminist Nellie McClung had argued that women voters would make the world a better place because of women's compassionate nature. She said, quote, "The woman's outlook on life is to save, to care for, to help. Men make wounds and women bind them up," end quote. In the heyday of the second wave feminist movement, in books such as In a Different Voice, published in 1982 by feminist moral philosopher and New York University professor Carol Gilligan, feminists argued that women developed as moral agents differently from men. Gilligan, for example, claimed that female morality didn't rely on rational principle, but rather on relationships and feeling, and that the result was an equally valuable, if not more valuable, way of being in the world. This is a notion with a long, complex history that goes at least as far back in English thought as the Romantic Revolution of the later 18th century, when philosophers argued about the kinds of wisdom that feeling can bring. Jane Austen had tackled the issue squarely in her 1811 novel, Sense and Sensibility, in which she demonstrated through her character Marianne how the romantic elevation of feeling above all else actually reduces empathy for others by encouraging selfish excess and preoccupation with self. Deliberately rejecting the message of Austen that such feeling had to be controlled, rejecting that message, the message of other traditional moralists, radical theorists claimed that those whose feelings were strongest were better than other people. And at its most extreme, this idea, adopted into feminism, gave permission to women to be emotional bullies, as is the woman in the article about Elizabeth Warren, and as are many feminist activists who march and demand and petition and cry "Me Too" as if their feelings justify all. To return to the article, Whitted makes it clear that she's more than willing to cause days of grief in her marriage, maybe weeks or months of grief over a small difference of political opinion, and isn't at all ashamed of that. What kind of woman has the gall to admit and even boast about her unreasonable behavior? Answer: a woman who believes that as a woman she has been wronged by the world and that her husband, and by extension all men, owe her recompense because of being born male. Feminists like Whitted stand as a striking refutation of Mary Wollstonecraft's argument back in 1792 that as women gained more rights and became less dependent on men and more highly educated, their intellectual and rational powers would come to dominate over their emotional natures. Wollstonecraft would be deeply alarmed by the self-indulgent and destructive nonsense that passes for women's activism today. In sum, feminism does women and men no favors in encouraging the weaknesses of female nature, women's resentment, self-pity, and lack of self-restraint, to become celebrated elements of female behavior, and in pretending that emoting is a sign of goodness. In fact, it is nothing more than a recipe for rancor and dysfunction in both family life and politics. I take little satisfaction in doubting that Whitted and her husband will ever vote together for a progressive woman president, because unless each is willing to make profound changes in their behavior, their marriage may well not last long enough.